Okay, so we are just at the top of the hour, so I think we will get started. So hello everyone, my name is Jessica Burke and I'm the Delivery Partner Program Manager and Regional Lead for BRCGS, as well as the President for the OFPA. We do have a great webinar planned for you today, and before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. So please keep yourselves on mute throughout the presentation. But do know that we do have some time for some questions at the end, and you have your choice. You can either type them in via the chat function, or if you're brave, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask your question when we can get around to you. We will be sharing the recording in our members section on the website after the event, so go ahead and look for that. And for those of you that aren't already members, or you don't know who we are, the OFPA was founded in 1958 as a nonprofit educational association. Our main objective was and still is to provide a common forum through a series of educational events that allows our members to exchange ideas and information, make connections, and build contacts with like-minded professionals. We strive to provide our members with hot topics and industry updates in food manufacturing in Ontario, specific to food safety that will affect your business. The association is also proud to be affiliated with the International Association for Food Protection. So if you're not already a member, please check out our website and learn more about the benefits and how to join. And moving on to the important topic of today, a multi-stakeholder collaboration in Canada involving food manufacturers, University of Laval, Canadian Allergists, and Canada's national patient organization, Food Allergy Canada, has led to the development of a new proposed allergen management guideline for food manufacturers. These guidelines aim to help support food manufacturers in their implementation of effective allergen control plans, including the responsible use of precautionary labeling to better meet the needs of Canadians managing food allergy. So today, we are joined by 4 special guests. So we have Beatrice Pavolo, Director of Food Safety and Regulatory Affairs, Food Allergy Canada, Sylvia Dominguez, Research Associate for University Laval, Samuel Godfrey, Full Professor, Food Risk Analysis and Regulatory Policies, Department of Food Science, University Laval, and Sher Mohammed, Director of Government and Industry Relations, Regulatory Management for Maple Leaf Foods. And they're going to tell us about the launch of the new guidelines and the related resources for the food industry. So thank you so much, all of you, for being here today, and I will now hand it over to Beatrice.
Great. Thanks so much, Jessica. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Great, and the slides are presenting okay?
Yep, everything looks great.
Okay, perfect. Just making sure we have no technical challenges. Thank you so much, Jessica, for having us today. We're really excited to speak to everyone. We're really happy to be at the conference in November as well to kind of give you a sneak peek into the guidelines that we discussed. We hope today will be of value and we'll kind of bring together some of the key concepts that we had discussed at our November meeting with a little bit more detail, a little bit more focus. So in terms of the agenda this afternoon, we're going to start off by talking a little bit about kind of why change is needed, looking at the different perspectives in terms of the Canadian landscape when it comes to food allergy. So I'll walk you through a little bit on the consumer perspective. Then we'll have Dr. Dominguez talk a little bit about the food manufacturer's perspective and CFIA recalls. From there, we're going to pass it over to Dr. Godefroy, who's going to give us an update from an international level on what's happening with Codex and some of the recommendations and discussions happening internationally. And then back to Dr. Dominguez to walk us through the guidelines and look at the various components specific to precautionary allergen labeling and risk assessment that we think you'll find extremely helpful and informative. And then from there, we will pass it over to Sharon, who will give us a little bit of her perspective on the guidelines and how this has worked through Maple Leaf Foods. And then, as Jessica said, we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So without further ado, just before we start, we do want to make an acknowledgement In terms of the project funding we were able to get for this project through the Agri-Assurance Program, we couldn't have done this without the support of Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada, so we do thank them for their support of this work. So when we talk about food allergy in Canada, what are we really talking about? Well, first and foremost, it is a serious medical condition that impacts over 3 million Canadians, including up to 600,000 children. In addition to that, 50% of Canadian households are impacted by food allergy in the sense that they're making a decision when they're purchasing food that impacts individuals with food allergy. So whether that's for schools, for daycares, people are in sports programs or through the workplace, 50% of households are making a decision based on someone in their and they're in their social circle or in their community that has a food allergy. So this isn't something that that impacts an individual and their family, but it has much more of a community impact. When you live with a food allergy, the reality is at the end of the day that there's no cure for food allergy currently. There's a lot of research that's being done, but today the biggest strategy that people have in terms of trying to prevent an allergic reaction is avoiding what they're allergic to. And what this really means is for people to be vigilant in all settings. So whether again it's in the workplace, dining out, going to the grocery store, in all different settings, people need to know what's in their food, no matter where it's being prepared or sold and served. So what that means is that people with food allergy and those that care for children with food allergy have to always be very vigilant. They have to be asking questions. They have to understand what's in their food in order to ensure that they do not come in contact with that particular allergen. And what that means is having access to a complete and accurate ingredient information. That really is the cornerstone for ensuring that people with food allergy can stay safe. So when we look at a label, for example, on a prepackaged product, we do often refer to that as a lifeline for consumers because really they're depending on that label to be truthful and accurate and to give them the information they need to make an informed decision. When we look at the regulatory framework here in Canada, it is very, very specific when it talks to the labeling of priority food allergens that are intentionally added to a product. So I think everyone understands from a labeling perspective, if you're using any of the common allergens, they must be included in the label, and they must be done so in plain, simple language. With the implementation of the Allergen Enhanced Framework that came into regulations that came into effect in 2012, it really put the focus on being able to provide information to consumers that's easy to understand and again to help them avoid their allergen. So in the bottom corner there, you just see a quick screenshot from the CFIA website showing how ingredients need to be included and how to call out allergens. And really there's two options. It can be in the ingredient list itself, again in plain simple language. It can also be called out in a contained statement, or it can be both. So those are different options that manufacturers can look at. However, when we look at precautionary allergen statements, or PAL, may contain statements, a couple of different ways to reference them, it's a little bit different. And what I mean by that is that if a manufacturer chooses to use a precautionary label to inform a consumer that there is a potential risk of a specific allergen that was not intended to be in the product recipe, they can use this type of statement to raise that warning for consumers. Now, it is not specifically regulated by Health Canada or CFIA, so it is up to the manufacturer to decide if they'd like to use that statement. And again, the focus is really to alert consumers on the unintended presence of an allergen that could be in that particular product. In general, from Health Canada's perspective, there is regulation that talks about information that is provided that must be truthful, clear, non-ambiguous, and not a substitute for good GMPs. However, specifically to say that there are requirements in terms of how and when to use that, it is not specifically regulated. Excuse me. Back in 2012, Health Canada also put out some guidance when it comes to precautionary allergen labeling, with the two goals being to minimize the risk for consumers with food allergy and to maximize choice of safe, nutritious food. As we'll see in the coming slides, we have challenges today in terms of meeting those specific goals and why we're talking to you today and why it's so important to put some rigor around the use of precautionary labeling. So from a consumer perspective, as I mentioned, they're looking for clear ingredient information. They're looking to be able to trust the label and understand how things are being presented. But currently, there are a number of challenges that consumers face, especially when it comes to precautionary labeling. So the first, as you'll see on the left-hand side, is what we call a blanket may contain statement. So we have a product, for example, that has a full ingredient list, and then it has a may contain. In this particular situation, it was an apple crumble, and that's the may contain that was included. So as you can see, all of the allergens, pretty much all of the allergens that weren't already included in the ingredient itself, in the ingredients itself of the package, were in the may contain. So one might ask, how can an apple crumble may contain fish or mullets, crustaceans, etc.? And when consumers see that, it doesn't give them comfort. It doesn't say, oh, I'm so glad that they have mentioned this to us. What it really raises to consumers is, what kind of good manufacturing practices are being put in place in that with that particular product or with that manufacturer? Because if they've got to may contain for all the allergens, that's concerning to understand how they run their operation. And we've seen more and more of these types of blanket statements, and unfortunately, they're really, from a consumer perspective, they're causing that trust and transparency that they need from manufacturers to really go down. So this is something that we have raised with Health Canada and CFIA as an ongoing concern, and something that we want to raise with industry as well, because the perception is not that it is, giving you a warning of sorts. It's more so what's happening there when, how are they managing allergens, or are they managing if they have a blanket statement on their products. The other issue is that the concept of a may contain or PAL statement has extended to areas that it was never intended. So when PAL was put in place, it was for prepackaged products only. However, as many of us have seen, whether you're out in the grocery store or you're in restaurants, there's allergen notices in a number of different areas that, again, provide the same type of warning in the sense of all allergens may have come in contact with this product. Again, that's not very useful for consumers. It actually kind of raises more questions and doubts. So these are some of the things that consumers are dealing with on a day-to-day basis anytime that they're purchasing products or eating out. In addition to that, there are a couple of concerning trends that we've seen over the last little while. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them today, just to kind of give you a sense of, again, where consumers' concerns are and what this means to them. So on the left-hand side, one of the things that we have been following here in Canada is some of the changes that are happening south of the border with their U.S. friends that had enacted the U.S. FASTER Act through Congress on January 1st of 2023. Basically, what that act did is that it declares sesame to be a new priority allergen in the United States. As you know, here in Canada, sesame has been part of our priority allergen list since the inception, but it was just added as a priority allergen in the US about a year ago, just over a year ago. Unfortunately, what we've seen as a result of that is not necessarily better labeling for sesame, but we've seen some manufacturers actually now, instead of using a precautionary statement for sesame, for example, we have seen that they are adding a little bit of sesame in the ingredients at the end of the label. So in this particular case, if you take a look, you'll see that sesame seeds is listed as a last ingredient, and then a contains statement after that in terms of the priority allergens. That is not considered good manufacturing practices to include an allergen that's not intended to be in the product as part of the label. And we've seen this now come through a number of products in the US. We're happy to say that in Canada, we have not seen this practice, and we hope that we don't see it because it's not something that we want to see as part of the process. But again, something that is happening south of the border that has had an impact in Canada. Another trend that we're seeing and another concern from consumers is what we call e-commerce sale. So like many consumers throughout the pandemic and even today, there's been a lot of online ordering of food, whether it's for food service or whether it's prepackaged products through grocery stores or third-party applications. And consistently what we found when we look at this opportunity is that unfortunately there's a lack of disclosure or information that's provided for ingredients as well as any type of precautionary labeling on some of these products. So some of the common scenarios that we found is that if you're purchasing on an online site, whether again it's a grocery store or a third-party platform, that there's not necessarily consistent ingredient information, that it doesn't always match up with what's on the physical product itself. And consistently, we have seen that the precautionary labeling that is on the physical product is not necessarily displayed online. So in this particular situation, we saw a package of pasta. It was labeled as you see here. However, on the physical product, there was a may contain for egg, for example, but it was not listed online. And as you can imagine, when that information is not consistent and accurate, it's very hard for consumers with food allergy to make safe, informed choices. And then the third thing, just to touch on quickly, is what we're seeing with vegan products. So as you know, by definition, vegan is not supposed to have any type of animal byproducts, including milk or egg. And what we found is that individuals that actually have milk and egg allergy are looking at vegan products as potentially safe options for them. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. In 2022, for example, there were 47 milk-related recalls through CFIA, and of that, 22 were dark chocolate products and 50% had a vegan claim. So we know that the interpretation when it comes to vegan for certain individuals is that is a safe option if you're allergic to milk and egg. Unfortunately, the reality is that may not necessarily be the case. So we're doing our part in educating consumers to make sure that they read the full ingredient label, they have questions, that they contact the manufacturer. But again, this type of product is causing some confusion and concern within the allergic population. And just as a quick reference, there was a recent article that was published with Dr. Dominguez and Dr. Godfrey and their team on vegan and plant-based claims in terms of how they impact individuals with egg allergy here in Canada. So definitely worth a read if you're interested. So what does this all mean at the end of the day in terms of consumer beliefs and behaviors? Well, we actually did a study, we did a survey of our consumers to kind of get a sense of where they're at in terms of reading the label, understanding the label, and their trust and efficacy in the label. So consistently what we saw is that there's not an overly confident population of individuals with allergies that believe in the accuracy of the label. I think we had about 2 out of 10 tell us that they were extremely confident. Others really had some lacking confidence in the labels as they stand today. Consistently, there's not a universal understanding of precautionary labeling. They're not quite sure when it's applied, how it's applied, and if it's consistent across all manufacturing. They find the concept of precautionary label very useful, but currently they find it confusing because they're not quite sure, again, what it means from manufacturer to manufacturer. It definitely limits the amount of safe food options because generally people who have a food allergy are told to avoid what they're allergic to if it's in the contain statement or in the may contain statement. So if we have proliferation of these precautionary labeling statements, it limits the amount of choices that they have. We've seen more blanket statements as we just talked about, and we're seeing more and more consumers contacting manufacturers to seek clarity on the label. I think our survey showed over 50% consistently call to ask questions because the label is not clear. So what the takeaway in all of this is that consumers need greater clarity and confidence in terms of food labeling. In terms of the resulting behavior, so what happens because this is how they feel, we are starting to see and have seen in the past consumers making their own risk assessment based on what information is presented on the label. And unfortunately, in some cases, people are taking a risk to consume may contain while others are not. But it's really important to understand that consumers need that clarity so that we're not doing this risk-benefit approach. At the end of the day, we also want to ensure that when they are looking at the label, that they feel confident and that they are able to make an informed decision. So with that, Allergy Canada, together with our partners at Laval University and Maple Leaf Food, brought together a collaboration of food manufacturers and groups within Canada to talk about how we're going to move forward on taking a risk-based approach to precautionary labeling. How can we create accurate labeling that consumers can trust, and how can we help the industry move forward? And hence was born the Canadian Allergen Management Guidelines that we will review with Dr. Dominguez. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Dominguez to kind of now walk us through the manufacturer's perspective and also give us an insight on the food recalls through CFIA.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Beatrice, for the very comprehensive overview and introduction to the project. I will go now into a bit more detail of some part of the preliminary work we did. So as you know, obviously the main goal of the project was to produce consensus guidelines for allergen management. We thought first the most obvious things to do was understand how are manufacturers managing allergens now in Canada and what types of challenges they may be facing. And we collected this information through a survey. And today I'll give you a very brief overview of some of the results we obtained. Next slide, please. The survey was opened during the summer of 2021, and we published the results open access 2022. Just a brief overview of our sample. We obtained 84 full responses covering all manufacturing sectors, and we had a high representation of large companies. Most of the respondents produced finished products with allergens as ingredients and or in PAL, not surprising. And they had a clearly defined allergen management approach, and the most prevalent allergens were soy and milk. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that was for you to have an idea of who answered these questions. The survey covered several aspects of allergen management in general in food industries, but today I will focus on the questions related to allergen thresholds. Allergen thresholds were used by almost half of our respondents, mostly for gluten and sulfites, for which, as you know, there are regulatory specifications, but not necessarily for PAL. This was an open question. Do you use thresholds in your allergen management program? And we asked specifically about the context of use, and overall thresholds, as you see in the bar plots on the right, were mostly used in connection with finished product testing when we analyzed the data globally. But when we broke it down per company size, this was not true for large companies who seem to apply them under a more preventive approach and also during incident management. And note also the little arrow here saying that only 12 respondents indicated using thresholds specifically for PAL. Next slide, please. So we asked deeper, or we went deeper into the issue about thresholds and PAL. This approach was perceived as useful by the majority of respondents, but as we just said, the actual application was limited. So we asked respondents about their concerns related to the use of thresholds for PAL. And in this figure, you can see we asked them to rank these 7 elements from least concerning in green to most concerning in kind of brown tan. And they were most concerned with legal and regulatory aspects and least with financial aspects. Next slide, please. Okay, so up to now, we know thresholds for PAL were perceived as useful by our respondents, but very few actually used them. So then we wanted to know, how is the need for PALs established? And we asked this question directly. So how does your company establish the need for PAL in finished products? These are the answers on the bar plot on the right. The first one is good. CCA means cross-contact allergens that cannot be avoided are declared in PAL. This is actually the purpose of using PAL. The second answer is a bit concerning. It says that cross-contact allergens that cannot be avoided are listed as ingredients. As you know, this is listing allergens that are not intentionally added in the ingredients list is against food labeling regulations in Canada. So maybe to go around this legal implication, some manufacturers, also the answer circled in red a bit lower, reported adding small quantities of allergens to avoid PAL, which is also questionable, kind of like what Beatrice was explaining about what's happening in the States with sesame. And then there were other criteria that are not really based on real risk. For example, listing all allergens used in the facility in PAL for every single product, right? So this is something that could be improved with a bit more of risk assessment awareness. Next slide, please. And then I just wanted to highlight one question that is not specifically about thresholds, but it's about the regulatory framework. We asked respondents to list resources that they found would be beneficial if government agencies were to provide or enhance. And what comes out of this is that from the number one answer that it looks like the current framework is not fully understood, as they specifically mentioned that they would benefit from our respondents, enhanced clarity on expectations related to current regulatory framework on food allergens and its enforcement. So we know we have a very robust food safety in general regulatory framework in Canada, but perhaps some issues related to allergen regulations and enforcement are not completely clear, and this is something we're trying to convey to regulators. Next slide, please. So that was a very quick overview of a thorough study. I invite you to read the full report. But in conclusion, what we noted was that there was overall pretty good allergen management awareness among the Canadian manufacturers, at least those that responded to the survey. We all know there's no standardized PAL criteria, but what was interesting in this study was that we documented the use of some concerning practices. In general, we also found out PAL thresholds are perceived as useful, but legal concerns are mostly what may be limiting their use. Some opportunities, I didn't go through this in detail, but when we analyzed the questions, the answers, breaking them down per company size, there are some allergen awareness opportunities for smaller medium manufacturers. We also noted the very strong influence of third-party quality systems on what is actually implemented in a facility, and is something that could be leveraged to enhance overall allergen management in the industry. And we, as you know, we advocate for introducing the risk assessment concept into regulations, not necessarily thresholds for PAL, but just the concept to kind of as a way to standardize the use of PAL, perhaps. Some challenges that were mentioned also were manufacturers receiving raw materials with PAL and that are accompanied with no further information. So there's an issue of whether you carry this forward or not, and based on what. And then there's also issues related to analytical testing that may not be fully understood. The use of analytical tests for allergens, they need to be validated for every single matrix and allergen and process. This is not simple, it's not cheap. Interpretation of results is also not that straightforward. We always recommend consulting with the kit manufacturers. And sampling. There's no standardized sampling plan for allergens, as for example is the case for microbiological hazards. So we have to be very careful when how to interpret the results of allergen testing. And that was a quick overview of the what we gathered from manufacturers. As part of our analysis of the baseline situation, let's say in Canada, we also wanted to know what was happening with recalls. We wanted to know if this data could show us if there are some sectors that are more challenging than others, for example. So we analyzed the data that you see here. These are CFIA recalls from the period 2017 to 2022. So we have the total number of food recalls reported on the website in the bar, and in red we have those related to allergens, undeclared allergens. So you see in this the 6 years that were analyzed, between 34 and 39% of food recalls were related to undeclared allergens. Something to notice is that this is not necessarily a representation of the non-compliances in the market, but rather of the samples that the CFIA investigated. So there could be categories that are targeted more often because of specific investigations, or they're new in the market, or there's reports of non-compliances internationally, etc. Okay. But in any case, the most important thing to to keep from this slide is that allergen recalls are still very prevalent. We haven't seen a change in this number in the last at least 6 years. We're still around 35%, so something has to be done if we want to change this. And one last thing also is that milk is by far the allergen most frequently linked to recalls. We found they're associated with more than 30% of the undeclared allergen recalls. This was globally. However, just notice this can vary per sector, because when we looked at the data per sector, for example, the allergen most associated with undeclared allergen recalls in the meat sector was egg. So something to keep in mind. And okay, with this information on recalls, I will now give the floor to Sami to bring us to a more international context. I talk a lot about the Canadian context, but Professor Godefroy is going to discuss the international context on this work.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sylvia. And again, also on behalf of the team at Université Laval and the collective team here, I would like to thank the Ontario Food Protection Association for giving us the opportunity to be part of this webinar and also to share with you the outcomes of the collaborative work that we have been carrying out over the past period. So obviously, when we started this work aiming for Canadian guidelines for food allergen management, it was important to position this work in the international context. And interestingly enough, and I would say it wasn't really a coincidence, this work coincided with a renewed interest by the international food regulatory community, and particularly the international food standard setting body, the Codex Alimentaris Commission, a renewed interest in looking at standards related to the labeling of allergens, but also the scientific advice that underpins this standard. Now, going back a little bit in history to remind us on what did Codex do in relation with allergens. Codex worked on a standard for labeling of priority allergens back in the 1990s. And basically this happened under the auspices of the Codex Committee on Food Labeling, hosted by Canada. And in fact, in 1999, a standard was adopted aiming essentially to identify those priority ingredients that would warrant additional attention if they are present deliberately in the composition of food, and therefore warranting a mandatory labeling. So essentially removing any type of exemptions that may be there. And I would say that after the adoption of that standard and its adoption was really a key milestone because it was the driver for so many other regulatory changes that took place around the world, starting with Australia, followed by the European Union, the United States, Canada, and so many other countries around the world relied on that standard to change their regulatory requirements vis-a-vis labeling of priority allergens. But since then, basically, there was kind of a silence in the Codex world vis-a-vis allergens until about 2018, where there was a renewed interest mostly to look at the practices of food production and aiming to provide additional guidance to food manufacturers, taking into account the learnings that have taken place over the world from the best practices to improve the management of food allergens. So if we move to the next slide. So this, in fact, has led to the adoption of a standard in the form of a code of practice, mainly under the auspices of the Codex Committee on Food Hygiene, which essentially supported improved practices for food allergen management. But then new questions also have arisen, mostly in the labeling context, and trying to look at a number of aspects. First of all, we wanted to know whether the priority allergens that were adopted in the 1990s would still be considered as a priority, and whether the criteria that helped establish those priorities might be subject to change. But also questions have been raised vis-a-vis the use of another category of labeling, which was found not to be covered by international guidance, and that's essentially precautionary allergen labeling. So in order for Codex to be able to conduct its work supported by the appropriate scientific advice, there were questions that were posed by CCFH, but also mainly by CCFL, so the Codex Committee on Food Labeling. So questions that were asked to the scientific advisory bodies of Codex, which tends to be JECFA, but it can be also an expert consultation that is managed by FAO, WHO. And there were three questions that were posed. First of all, again, looking at the list of priority allergens and asking to validate this priority list or to update it. The second question was in relation with threshold levels and whether it is possible, based on the scientific and clinical information that is available, if it's possible to establish threshold levels related to the reaction to priority allergens. And finally, the third question was to provide any scientific underpinning that would support a decision-making process as to when a precautionary allergen labeling could be or should be applied on a food label. So that's the work that was carried out by the scientific advisory group. And in fact, this has led to the publication of a number of reports that are now accessible. And one of the first outcomes was to confirm the guidance related to the adoption of the list of ingredients that we would consider as priority allergens, and in fact actually supporting the criteria to consider those ingredients to be priority allergens. So those are the foods or the ingredients that would cause immune-mediated hypersensitivities, but also considering key criteria related to prevalence, and mainly international or global prevalence, also the severity of the reaction as a result of the possible consumption of these ingredients by those sensitive individuals, but also the potency of the reaction, meaning the ability to induce a reaction at very low doses. And as a result of that, the list was reviewed, and in fact, looking at these criteria, looking at the body of information available, the expert group has concluded that some changes could be brought to the list of priority allergens. And for example, sesame, which was not included in the priority list, now was recommended for inclusion to be a priority allergen at the global level, whereas soy, which was part of the priority list, was now deemed no longer to be considered as part of that priority list for the global context. At the same time, a number of other allergens were identified to be of relevance as priority allergens, but not at the global level, at the regional level. And this is also a recognition that the issue of priority allergens needs to be considered in the regional or national context, using, of course, the information related to the dietary patterns, but also national or regional prevalence. So celery, lupin, and mustard were considered as part of this secondary list or the regional list of allergens. And at the same time, also the group recommended to keep a number of other ingredients under what they call the watch list, and this is in recognition of the changing patterns in food production with the increased introduction of new sources of protein of plant origin like pulses, but also the introduction of insects and other sources of protein in food production. So again, this is to be watched in the future. Again, the next slide. In relation with the second question for the establishments of thresholds, and the group actually considered that there was sufficient information that could help them develop thresholds that could be used for risk assessment purposes. And they looked at the data that was available globally and that was submitted to the group. There was a consensus to consider that the value that they would rely upon is what they call the EG5 value. Basically, this is the value or the amount of proteins below which 95% of consumers would not react. So essentially, it's the value at or above which only 5% would react. And they've established, in fact, reference doses and a recommendation for these reference doses for the list of priority allergens that is presented here. At the same time, the group also identified that if we are to establish threshold values, and these threshold values might be used in the context of risk assessments, these risk assessments most likely will be relying on findings of allergens in food, and these findings will be requiring to use analytical methods. Again, there was a consideration about the type of analytical methods and how appropriate they would be to be used either to test for food, so for finished products, but also for food sources. And also there were questions posed about the minimum performance requirements for these analytical methods if they are to be used, whether be it in the context of food quality practices by industry, but also and more specifically in the regulatory context. Now, the next slide is actually an attempt to answer the third question that was posed to the advisory group, and that's how can we develop a scientific foundation that would support the decision-making process as to when a precautionary allergen labeling would be warranted. And interestingly enough, in fact, the group decided on a decision tree that you will see that it is quite similar, in fact, to what we have landed on as part of the collective group in Canada. And in a nutshell, basically there was a clear recommendation that the reliance on precautionary allergen labeling needs to be based on a risk assessment. And if this risk assessment needs to be quantitative, that quantitative approach needs to be based on the assessment of the quantity of allergens that might be uptaken or might be consumed, coming, of course, from an unintended source, and comparing that value of intake to the thresholds that have been established. And in a very simplistic way, if we are above the threshold, meaning that there is a risk that is documented, therefore the labeling would be warranted. If we are below that threshold after estimating that intake, then the labeling on a precautionary basis would not be needed. And this would have an impact to reduce the reliance on precautionary allergen labeling when it's not supported by a risk assessment. Now, of course, the outputs of this evaluation and this advice was made in order to be used by Codex, Codex being the international risk manager. And in fact, discussions took place at the last Codex Committee on Food Labeling, which was hosted by Canada and in Ottawa. And basically, some recommendations were made, mainly to change the list of priority allergens. And this was further corroborated and was further endorsed by the Codex Alimentarius Commission at the last meeting in November in Rome. So we've seen some changes to that major text related to the labeling of priority allergens when they are deliberately added as ingredients. But more work is required right now to look at a dedicated guidance on how precautionary allergen labeling needs to be applied, particularly vis-a-vis the reliance on a risk assessment and how that risk assessment could use the threshold values. And further discussions are expected at the upcoming Codex Committee on Food Labeling, which will be hosted in Quebec City in October of this year. And then subsequently, hopefully, if we manage to have an agreement, hopefully these considerations will lead to a possible international standard and an international guidance on precautionary allergen labeling. So that's what we hope for the upcoming period. This concludes, in fact, this part of the overview on the international context. And back to Sylvia now with the guidelines that you worked on.
Thank you so much, Sammy, for the international context. So now we're finally at the moment of the introduction of the guidelines. This was one of the most important output of this project, but as Beatrice will explain later, there are other accompanying resources. But first of all, let me tell you how we develop the content you will see, basically, because I don't want you to believe that we made this up, okay? We started with a review of available guidance. As you probably know, there are actually several reference documents from other international organizations or agencies, somehow or directly related to allergen management. So not to reinvent the wheel, of course, we started by reviewing everything that was already out there, and we developed actually a systematic summary of this information. We also held several brainstorming sessions with our stakeholders group This was with the purpose of establishing what we wanted to transmit to Canadian manufacturers with our guidelines. Where were the most important challenges to address? Which were the best practices we wanted to share? Where we needed to find more information, etc. And the goal was to come up with basically an outline of what we wanted to further develop. We realized we needed some new data, so we collected this information through the manufacturer survey, for example, that I mentioned, and the consumer survey that Beatrice also mentioned. Then we started writing. We actually set up a drafting committee with some of the members of our stakeholders group, and this was a shared process where not only us at Laval University, not only Food Allergy Canada started writing something, our manufacturers were really engaged with this process, and we all wrote and reviewed and made any changes necessary. So this was a product of collaborative work. And then when we had a final draft, we presented it for validation to our broad stakeholder group, who also had, of course, some comments to suggest that we integrate it in our document. And the final product is what you would see, or what you can see now online as the guidelines document that we call version 1, because for sure there will be other reviews, especially when people start using them and send us their feedback. So basically what you would find in this document are allergen management best practices that are internationally recognized and also have the input of our Canadian manufacturers. And we present a structured risk assessment approach to guide PAL decisions and hopefully better meet the needs of allergic consumers. So this is the table of contents of the main document of the guidelines. You can see it covers introductory sections like food allergy and regulatory requirements. And then we focus, of course, on allergen management. This is the core of the document. It basically describes in detail how to develop an allergen control plan, which, as you know, outlines a facility strategy to prevent introducing unintended allergens to a product, and also outlines how specific measures are to be implemented, monitored, and evaluated. So each of the elements from A to E that you see in this process map are developed in detail in the document. The first 4, so hazard identification, and the identification, implementation, and evaluation of control measures, are really not different in principle from what you already know in the context of PCPs or hazard plans. The added value or the difference is that we present them as an enhanced and more thorough version that targets allergens specifically, and again that we have incorporated the most recent recommendations from international and Canadian experience. So I won't spend time on these elements during this presentation. Each section is actually very well explained in the document, but I wanted to highlight just that section C, related to control measures, is very thorough. Of course, control measures are specific to the facility, the allergen, the product, the process, etc. But we do provide extensive information on strategies that could be applicable, and other resources focusing on, we've broken them in, I believe, 13 elements. For example, raw materials, human resources, supply chain, process design, etc. So each manufacturer would have access to all of this like catalog of potential strategies, but then they would need to be adapted. These are general recommendations. Manufacturers will adapt them to their specific operation and risks. The last element, communicate risks, is where we go beyond what's currently available in other guidance documents, and this will actually be the focus of the rest of the presentation. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, the process flow that you see here is the continuation from the one you just saw. So from the one listing the allergen control plan steps, but we have expanded it here to show the steps involved in risk communication. So the first figure you see here, as we all know, refers to allergens that are added as ingredients. And this one must be declared on a product's label. This is a regulatory requirement. And these allergens should have been identified during the hazard identification step. The next step is assessing the need for PAL. This is what I will expand more for the purpose of this presentation. So the premise of the approach we will present here is that PAL must only be used to communicate the unintentional, unavoidable presence of allergens present at a level that poses a risk to food allergic consumers as determined by a risk assessment. So we all hear risk assessment here, risk assessment there, but how do we actually do this? And specifically, how do we do this for allergens? This was one of the main goals of our project, to propose a framework for this risk assessment. And what we propose, and I will explain later, is that the risk assessment should be first qualitative, following a weight of evidence approach. And only if this assessment is inconclusive, then you will need to do a quantitative assessment that relies on comparison to reference doses or thresholds, like Professor Godefroy explained. And we'll continue explaining this on the next slide. So let's start. We said we would start first with a qualitative assessment. This is basically a review of the process based on objective evidence of when control measures pass or fail. The key word here is objective evidence. And this is something that manufacturers most likely already have. We're talking about, for example, records showing the achievement of recognized cleaning standards, training records, validation studies, etc. We need to consider, however, that some factors can have a stronger or a more direct effect on the occurrence of cross-contact allergens than other factors. And this is where we will incorporate the weight of evidence approach. We also need to know that this type of assessment is relatively subjective, so it could be influenced by the experience of the assessors. So it's necessary to have a multidisciplinary team with thorough knowledge of the operation conducting it. In this little process map, you see once you gather your evidence or your objective evidence systematically for every step of the process, the qualitative assessment at the end will conclude one of the following choices. So either there is sufficient supporting evidence that the control measures can consistently prevent the occurrence of cross-contact allergens. So in this case, we could say PAL is not considered necessary. The opposite could be true, that the evidence shows that control measures cannot actually prevent the occurrence of unintentional allergens. And in this case, PAL would be needed. Or there may be insufficient evidence to reach any conclusion at this point. So we would have to go through a quantitative assessment only at this point. But the important thing here is that you can actually reach decisions related to PAL based on a qualitative assessment. So let's see in the next slide, how can we do this with an example, okay? We're going to say that we have a baker that makes cookies. And keep in mind, this is just an example to illustrate how this is done. It's not a real case. So this baker makes cookies that we're going to call cookie A that contain milk right before another cookie that we'll call B that does not contain milk, using the same equipment. So we need to know if PAL for milk is necessary for cookie B. So what the manufacturer does is they start collecting evidence, and you can press click, please, Beatrice. Yes. For the allergen control measures in every step of the project. So to simplify, we've grouped them here in this table in big main steps. The first one, we have raw materials. There are control measures in place related to allergens here, of course, related to receiving, identification, storage, etc. We know the ingredient that comes with the allergen in this case is very easy to identify. It's skim milk powder. So there are procedures in place. Personnel are trained. The evidence shows that training is conducted at the usual frequency. There are no non-conformities related to or incidents related to, for example, misidentification or storage. So basically here we're going to say that evidence shows that milk is clearly identified, handled, and stored. However, this is not the point that has a direct effect on the occurrence of milk in our cookie B. So the evidence at this point, we're going to call it weak, because it has a very minor effect. Related then to design of premises and equipment, again, this is something that could be important, right? In this case, the control measures are that the equipment is recent and it allows for proper cleaning. So evidence shows us that the design of the equipment does not hinder cleaning. But again, this doesn't have a direct effect. So we're going to have a wait of week at this point. Production, then we're reaching something that could have a more direct or stronger effect. In this case, for the sake of the example, we're going to say scheduling cannot be changed. This is what would be done, right? But we're going to say it cannot be done just for the example. So the presence of milk in A is actually addressed in the changeover procedures. We have this as control measure. And training of changeover personnel is adequate and is conducted at the regular frequency, the required frequency. So again, the evidence shows us that the possibility of cross-contact is addressed in the changeover procedures, but again, they do not ensure the absence of cross-contact, right? This is important, but we don't see still a very direct effect. So we're going to give it a medium weight. And then cleaning, the control measures we have is that meeting a visually clean standard is required. There has been a validation study that analytically shows that milk proteins are not detected in B when cleaning is conducted after the production of A, the cookie with milk. And the validation study is robust and is recent. And there's also verification of cleaning specifically related to milk detection on surfaces. The evidence shows us that all of this is in order, is compliant, and the cleaning assures that there's no visible residue, and analytical tests report undetectable milk proteins in B. So here we have very strong evidence of a very direct effect of a control measure that will, in combination with all the other preceding measures, allow us to say that we can consistently prevent the occurrence of milk in the cookie B when produced after A, so the manufacturer decides with this qualitative assessment that PAL for milk is not required. Next slide, please. And I'll go very quick because we have like 4 minutes. So then let's imagine we have another assessment that was not conclusive. We're going to do a quantitative one. Here, what we're going to do is, as Professor Godefroy mentioned, we need to calculate an exposure dose that is based on two things, the allergen protein concentration in the product and the amount that is consumed in one eating occasion. And we're going to compare this. This is going to give us an exposure dose, so the amount of allergen protein that a consumer would ingest with the food product. We need to know if this dose would put the consumer at risk. And how do we do this? By comparing it to a reference eliciting dose or a threshold. So let's go to the next slide to go through the example. Here we're going to say we have a chips manufacturer, potato chips, and they have as an ingredient a seasoning mix that carries PAL for soy. The manufacturer, we're going to say, tried a qualitative assessment, and they couldn't reach any conclusion because they actually didn't have any information on where this PAL was coming from, but why was it used in the raw material? They didn't know, so they couldn't assess much. So I decided to go further into their investigation, and the main question was, do we need to carry forward this may contain to the finished product or not? So remember we said we need a reference dose to base our comparison on, and we don't have any in Canada, an official regulatory requirement, but you can find this in the literature. So for this example, we're going to say the manufacturer is going to use a dose of 0.5 milligrams of soy proteins. This comes from Australia's VITAL program, and it's a dose that's been estimated to protect 99% of soy allergic individuals. So this is the value we're going to compare to see if we are in a risky situation or not. Now we have to calculate the exposure dose, the dose in the food that you're selling to the consumer. One of the variables we need is to know how much food is consumed in one eating occasion. And we're talking about the one eating occasion because an allergic reaction can occur very quickly. So we need to not cover what was eaten in a whole week, but what you're likely to eat at one sitting. In this example, we're going to use data from a Canadian survey from 2015, where they report actually daily consumption, but of the category savory snacks. So chips would be savory snacks, and this is something you usually eat not throughout the day, a bag of chips in the morning, then 2 in the afternoon, then 3 later. You usually sit, have a bag of chips, and that's the end of it. So we're going to use this value as one eating occasion. And the bag of chips that our manufacturer makes weighs 28 grams. So he's going to say 2 bags would be a worst case eating occasion, because it's actually higher than the mean that is reported in the Canadian Consumer Survey, and it's higher than the 50th percentile of consumption also. So we're going to say 56 grams is our worst case eating occasion. Next slide, please. Now, to calculate our exposure dose, we need to know also how much allergen concentration is expected to be in the food that will be consumed. And we'll do this without testing finished product. Instead, we're going to use worst case estimates from previous steps. So remember we said the spice mix contained only a pile that said may contain soy. So the manufacturer will contact the supplier to try to get more information. This is something we really encourage you to do. Receiving a raw material just that says may contain with no other information shouldn't be acceptable. So let's say he finds out or she finds out, our manufacturer, that the supplier, the soy pal comes from soy flour that the supplier uses in their operations. It's because they don't have it under control. They seem to find it sometimes in different products, sporadically, not homogeneously distributed. Some lots of some ingredients have this contamination, others not, so that's why they put their pal everywhere. And they also did some tests, the supplier, and they have they report that they find soy flour at levels as high as 15 ppm in the seasoning mix that their manufacturer is purchasing. So this information, okay, it's not fully representative, but it's something that allows us to develop a worst case scenario. So we're going to assume that all lots of spice mix are contaminated with 15 ppm of soy flour. Now, notice I keep saying soy flour, but we need to compare to our exposure to our reference dose that is in soy protein. So for that, we need to use a conversion factor. And here we have a 0.4, 40% that comes from the literature that is used to convert soy flour to soy protein. So you see in the calculation here, the maximum concentration of soy protein in the spice mix will be obtained by multiplying 15, so the maximum soy flour content, by 0.4 to convert to soy protein, and then we have 6 milligrams of soy protein per kilo of this spice mix raw ingredient. Now, if we look at our specification sheet for the chips, we see that the recipe contains 12% of this spice mix and that there is a baking step that results in 6% total weight loss. So the concentration of soy proteins will calculate it for a 100 bag of chips, 100 kilo batch of chips to simplify our computations. So we will be adding 12 kilos of the spice mix, and we know in 1 kilo of spice mix there's 6 milligrams of soy protein. And then the 12 kilos multiplied by 6 gives us 72 milligrams of soy protein. Now we consider there was water loss, remember, so we don't have 100 kilos anymore. Now we have 94. And the concentration of soy protein in the product, in the finished product, in the chips, in a worst case scenario, we're going to obtain it by dividing 72 by 94. And this gives us 0.77 milligrams soy protein per kilo of chips. Next slide, please. That was a lot of numbers. Beatrice, if you can just please, yes. So to recap, okay, we're using, 0.5 milligrams as a reference eliciting dose. The soy protein concentration in the chips was 0.77, and the maximum amount consumed in one eating occasion was 2 bags of chips, or 0.056 kilos to keep our units. So if there's 0.77 milligrams of soy protein in 1 kilo of chips, In these 2 bags of chips, there will be 0.043. And this is our exposure dose. This is the amount of protein, soy protein, that your consumer would be exposed to from eating your chips. And we'll compare it to a reference dose that was 0.5. So we see it's much smaller. So in this case, the manufacturer decides not to use PAL for soy. Wow, and that was it. We did a very quick quantitative assessment, and we're late. So I'll go quickly through these recommendations. No, I think I'll just give the floor back to Beatrice so you can wrap it up before we lose everybody.
No worries. Thank you so much, Sylvia, and thank you so much, Dr. Godefroy. We do apologize. We are running a few minutes over, but we do have a couple of things that we'd like to get through. So we hope you can continue to join us. In terms of the resources that Sylvia mentioned, all of this is available for free in English and French. Download it at foodallergycanada.ca/allergen guidelines. And what you'll find there is a link to the guidelines themselves, plus a number of other resources, including a training program, self-assessment tools, and others that we hope that you'll have a chance to look at. Just for reference, what Sylvia was just going through in terms of the quantitative risk assessment, we know there was a lot there. That's on page 77 of the guidelines, if anyone would like to go ahead and take a look there. So again, please feel free to download them. We'd love to get your feedback. Just before we wrap up, though, we'd like to give the floor to Sharon Mohammed, who will speak very briefly on the guidelines themselves and her perspective as a food manufacturer in terms of what she feels they can help in terms of precautionary allergen labeling for manufacturing. So Sharon, I will pass it over to you.
Luckily, I only have one slide to wrap this up, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about PAL in practice. So 5 years ago, about 5.5 years ago, we had a consumer complaint for an allergic reaction. That was in 2018. We did an investigation, found out that all of the blenders in the same room, when they were processing milk, there was a poof of dust, and that transferred on to the other blenders. And that was a very reactive approach. Since the guidelines have been launched, this has been formed a framework and a structure for what we've done since 2018. And I know the guidelines were just released last November, but we've been working on them before they were released and published. But what we do at Maple Leaf Foods is we've built in a risk assessment approach in our product development process, which is Dr. Sylvia alluded to in the qualitative approach, a control measure approach, the HACCP food safety approach. So we do that for new product launches. Even if we revise a product formula, we do that as well. And also if there's new science. And for the new science, I want to talk about something that has actually come to the forefront is there's new science that says, I'll just go back, MSM, mechanically separated meat or finely textured meat, is considered meat. You label it as meat. It actually is made from old chickens, hens, the whatever meat is left on the bones, they're crushed up. And that is made into MSM and or FDM based on different mesh sizes. And we use that in some of our products at our company, but many other companies use that as well. There's a potential of egg allergen being on that product because of the inherent risk of eggs in the cavity of the hens, the old chickens. So what we've done is beyond the control measures in the facility, which we do through a food safety quality regulatory risk assessment approach and a qualitative assessment approach, is we now are assessing if we need to put a PAL label on there. So to do that, we've done calculations using thresholds that exist, EDO1 and EDO5, to determine based on different formulations, if a PAL label needs to be on there. We haven't gone out and tested the product. You don't have to, just like Dr. Sylvia said, you don't have to do that. You can do a theoretical and a calculation to determine if there is a risk. Prior to all of this, like early days, about 4 years ago, the regulators from the supplier said, oh, we see there's a risk there. Our supplier just put a PAL label on their raw material, which then made us starting to think, which question our inspectors in our plants where the finished product is made that consumers purchase, they were forcing us to put a PAL label on that finished product. But we took this risk-based approach using the guidelines to make that decision. So that's just what I wanted to cover today from a manufacturer's and a practical approach.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Sharon. Again, sorry for the rush at the end, but we really appreciate your context and how Maple Leaf has been proactive in managing precautionary allergen labeling. So with that, we have come to the end of the official presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If I could just ask Dr. Goodwin, Dr. Dominguez, and Sharon, if you can keep your cameras on. I'm not sure, Jessica, I know, I apologize again, we're pressed for time, but we are happy to stay on a few more minutes to answer any questions that the audience might have.
Yeah, I think we'll give it a couple of more minutes because I do see that there's at least one question in the chat.
Sure.
So Ellen is asking what would be a realistic timeline to have the international guidance for PAL in place with Codex approval?
Samuel, would
So
you
I
like to
think
take that
Sam,
one?
Sure, sure. It could be as fast as the end of this year if essentially we manage to get the consensus on the document during the October meeting. And certainly I think the Canadian stakeholders will be playing a key role in moving that forward. I mean, if we take other parallels, it took just one session of CCFL to review the list of priority allergen and to adopt the first part of the of the updated guideline. And there was actually significant work done on the draft guidance, but more is needed. And it is possible that we move to a proposed text that will be forwarded for adoption at what we call step 5.8. 5.8 means that we actually use the accelerated procedure. And given that CCFL is I guess strategically positioned this year before the commission, because the commission is happening in November and not in July as before, we kind of gain a year in that. So this would be forwarded to the commission a month after and has a chance to be adopted as an international standard. So all hinges on the October discussions.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Samuel. Does anybody else have any questions? You can either type in the chat, or if you wanted to raise your hand and ask using your voice, that would be perfectly fine too. While we're waiting for that, I will just ask one quick question. So we talked a lot about risk assessment, and for a company like Maple Leaf Foods, for example, that's very embedded in the food safety systems. And I'm just wondering, for like a smaller plant or somebody who's just kind of getting started, what kind of tools are available in order to help them through that process?
Sylvia, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take that one. So the guidelines actually have been developed for any size of company, any size of and any sector. Actually, they're generic. The principles of risk assessment are not complicated. There's actually high chances that they are already doing a risk assessment. What the guidelines present is more of a systematic approach, or the way to build it as evidence and keep it on some type of records. But the process, I'm pretty confident, is not hard to grasp. So resources are there from our side in the form of the document itself. We have also recorded training sessions that go through every content of the guidelines. And I believe they are accessible to smaller or medium companies. As we said, not everybody and not in every case has to do a quantitative assessment. You can reach a very high number of decisions for PAL based on qualitative assessments. The important thing is to have the information organized systematically and to follow the basic risk assessment steps. So that is something we want to, if you can give us feedback on from small or medium companies, that's something we would love to have to better adapt our resources to this type of operation.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So we've got two more questions, and I'm going to go through them quickly, and then we probably should wrap it up just in the interest of time. So is segregating allergens based on level 1, 2, and 3 severity the best way of storing allergens?
And I attempted to answer that by saying that we would not have a sub-ranking actually for allergens. It's either the allergen is a priority allergen or it is not. If it is a priority allergen, it is subject to all the attention and all the risk management requirements.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. Before we wrap up, I am going to ask for those of you that are still here with us and are comfortable, if you could turn your cameras on. We all, during our OFPA webinars, like to take a photo of everybody that has attended, and then I'm going to get one of my OFPA colleagues to take a screenshot, and we'll post that all over social media.
While that's happening, Jessica, just on behalf of Sharon and Sylvia and Sammy and myself, we just wanted to say thank you so much for inviting us here today. We're happy to take any follow-up questions after the webinar. If anyone would like to submit directly to you, please feel free to share. And again, we encourage everyone to look at the guidelines and download it. And as Sylvia said, we'd love to get some feedback on anything you think might be missing or any additional tools that we can look at developing in the future. Thanks again.
No problem. And thank you so much, Beatrice, Sharon, Sylvia, and Samuel as well for joining us today. And I wish we had more time, because I feel like we could continue the topic for, you know, an hour. I think photo.
Got a couple of pictures.
Perfect. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us today. We hope to see you at our next webinar, which is in February, and we're going to be talking about the common principles of QA and product safety between food and edibles. And once again, thank you so much to our speakers for joining us today. Everybody enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.